Chew.tv introduces gifting, Southampton 16, and the Newsonomics of Podcasting.
Welcome to the Richard Daly Podcast, bringing you a UK perspective on the latest news and developments from the world of podcasting and internet radio.
Welcome to episode 18 with me, Richard Daly. I'll start off this week with some news and articles, but then I'm going to focus on a conference I attended this week at the University of Southampton here in the UK. So firstly, something for you if you're an online DJ. Chew.tv, the UK-based live streaming platform for DJs and producers, has introduced gifting functionality. Now, the aim of gifting is to allow Chew's creators and consumers to monetize their activity and engagement on the platform. Gifting allows users on Chew to buy and gift each other digital products which hold financial value. The value of the gift is transferred to the receiving user, minus, of course, a card transaction fee, which sounds fair enough. This looks like a great idea. It's similar to that used on several social sites, including one that I use, BeGo Live. Podcasting news now, and Nieman Lab has published a 5-part series of in-depth articles by Ken Doctor titled The Newsonomics of Podcasting. There is so much material in these articles that I think I'll just talk about the first of these today, and then we'll cover the rest in the next couple of episodes of the podcast. Okay, the first article in the series is called An Island No More, Inside the Business of the Podcasting Boom. So this article, the first in the series, looks at the big picture of podcasting. A key part of the article is the money that's coming into podcasting at the moment, especially the fact that venture capital firms are starting to get involved in the industry. This, of course, is being driven by the increase in advertising revenue that we're currently seeing. The article notes that podcast advertising expanded by 48% in 2015 and that it's forecast to grow about 25% a year until at least 2020. The author says that this will mean annual advertising revenue for podcasting in 2020 will be close to $500 million a year. A quote from NPR says that they're earning more than $10 million in podcast revenue already, and they're getting advertising from major brands such as Dell and Target. So, of course, the big money is going to the podcast networks. These, of course, are able to show the kind of overall listening figures that can attract the big advertising agencies and brands. There's a lot more in this article, including a discussion on the challenges of podcast metrics that I've covered many times already, as well as looking at the increasing number of broadcasting professionals being attracted into podcasting. There's also an interesting discussion that looks at the similarities of the development of podcasting with that of the internet and online businesses in general over the last 20 years. Do read this article for yourself. It's a great introduction into the business of podcasting. You'll be able to find a link, of course, in the show notes for this episode at richarddaly.com/18. Jeff McHugh has authored an article for Radio Inc. this week that states, "You should be podcasting in 2017 or sooner." Jeff McHugh is a media talent coach who works with radio, television, video and podcast personalities in North America. The article is written from a radio perspective, but looks at where advertisers who used to advertise on radio are now looking to spend their money, and he concludes that many are looking towards podcasting. Jeff starts with an interesting anecdote. Apparently he searched for the terms radio and podcast on the Adweek website. Only 7 articles came up from the last 3 months for radio, but there were more than 3 times that number for the term podcast. So advertisers are always looking for new places to promote their brands, so I guess this is the kind of measure that's going to get them excited about podcasting. The author then goes on to make an interesting, if that's the right word for it, statement. He says, and I quote, "Frankly, podcasts are not very good. As soon as an excellent podcast from an experienced broadcaster like NPR, Adam Carolla, The KVJ Show, or KUPD's John Holmberg goes on iTunes, it finds an audience quickly." Now, I guess the radio background shows through here, and I assume he's looking and talking about the kind of radio-style production values and professional hosts and bringing those into podcasting. Of course, we know that the amateur podcaster is still a huge part of the industry, does a great job, and will always be there. Now on to the main item I want to cover this week. On Thursday, I attended a new podcasting conference at the University of Southampton here in the UK. This was organised by Stefan Kasper, who is the media development lead for the Institute for Learning, Innovation and Development at the university. The aim of the event was to reveal the secrets of producing professional quality podcasts on a limited budget, along with tips on the podcasting process, presenting and interviewing. The main audience for the conference was researchers, educators and university staff, but there were a number of external attendees as well, like myself, including a number from the UK podcasters community. The day kicked off with a presentation from Martin Austwick, Martin's a well-known podcaster in the UK. He's been podcasting since 2007. He discussed what podcasts are and how they can be used to engage with an audience. He encouraged podcasters to ask themselves, why would people want to listen to your show? And he emphasised the need to build sustainable podcasts. I think all podcasters know that it's easy to start a podcast, but much more difficult to keep it going. During the morning, there were 2 breakout sessions. In the first, Kelly Long, who presents the Inspiration for Teachers podcast, talked about building your brand and how this can help avoid the dreaded pod fade. Kelly believes you can achieve this by working on building influence and engaging with your audience, which will help build trust and loyalty. Interestingly, in contrast to Martin Austwick, Kelly puts more focus on working on the quality of your podcast, particularly in terms of content and message, rather than just getting started. She also talks about establishing the purpose and focus of your podcast before you launch it, and I think she sees podcasts as being a funnel into your other business services. It was a much more business-like approach to podcasting. Nothing wrong with that, of course. That's the beauty of podcasting. There are no rules. Karen Woods then demonstrated how valuable interviewing guests can be and how to ask questions that will bring out answers that will interest your audience. In the other morning session, Kevin Field from the podcast Radio Skills for Podcasters discussed how to write and plan a successful show. Now, this was a similar message that he presented at this year's New Media Europe conference, but he did tailor it very well for the educators in the audience. After lunch, there were more breakout sessions. Joe Dale, a man clearly passionate about podcasting, demonstrated a number of apps for the iOS platform that can allow you to record and publish a podcast really easily and absolutely free. Joe is another long-time podcaster, having started in 2006. He talked about apps such as Opinion, Auphonic and Boss Jock Jr., amongst many others. I did pick up on one app I hadn't heard of before. That was Ferrite Recording Studio, which looks to be a useful audio recording and editing app. I'm going to try that out on my iPad when I'm away out of the country in the next couple of weeks. I didn't get to see the other session, but Isabella and Mike Russell from Music Radio Creative talked about how important being consistent in publishing your podcast is, and demonstrated the power of Adobe Audition for recording and editing your podcast. After these sessions, all the conference attendees came back together again and heard from Dave Pickering. He brought some fresh insights, particularly about taking advantage of the lack of rules in podcasting to do what you want to do. He also made the point that we're all happy to listen to poor quality audio on mobile phones these days, so most people are also happy to accept less than perfect audio quality on your podcast. A key point that Dave made was that you are the first member of your own audience, so make sure you're making something that you want to hear. He's very much in the camp of just getting started and realising that it will take some time before your podcast is as good as you'd really like it to be. Dave also introduced the audience to the concept of GPS-enabled podcast apps that play different audio clips depending on your location. He mentioned an example of an app for the Soho area of London that you can download, and this tells you the history of that area as you move around. The final speaker of the day was Sophie Bailey from the EdTech podcast. She talked about leaving her job and explained how she got into podcasting. She discussed her approach to putting together podcast episodes and how she promotes her shows. I thought it was quite interesting that she puts her show notes onto SlideShare, and this strikes me as a really good way of reaching additional audience through that website. Sophie also discussed how to make use of existing contacts that you probably have. Now, by far my biggest takeaway of the day was the diversity in podcasting. During her presentation, Kelly Long asked the group who'd heard of John Lee Dumas. Now, I was really surprised that I was the only person in the room to raise my hand. I think it's easy to assume that everyone listens to the same kind of podcast you do. I learned that this is certainly not the case. So it was a really good conference. The organisers are talking about running it every year, so I hope they do, and looking forward to seeing what else comes out of Southampton University. A quick piece of news from Patreon now. I know many podcasters use Patreon as a way of getting financial support from their audience, and it seems Patreon are well aware of this. Patreon have just announced that you can now give your patrons private RSS links to access your content. I'll link to the instructions on how to set up the links in the show notes for this episode at richarddalley.com/18. An article from Audiocast now. This is by Jennifer Lane and is titled Just Make Sure They Know It's an Ad. Jennifer discusses recent research from Edison Research and from the Interactive Advertising Bureau showing that podcast listeners prefer native host-read ads to recorded ones. According to the research, 55% of podcast listeners expressed a positive sentiment to hearing an advert when it was read by the podcast host, but only 34% felt the same about pre-recorded adverts from a sponsor. So listeners like host-read adverts, and of course that's always been the way that most podcasters get started with advertising. And this style of ad is of course cheaper for the advertiser, and of course the advertisers like them because the audience likes them. At the end of the article, the author notes that both podcasters and advertisers should be aware of regulator guidelines for truth in advertising, particularly from the FTC in America. It has to be clear that it is an advert. Of course, that can be difficult sometimes when the ad is being read by the podcast host. So if you're doing this style of advertising, do take some time to think about it and make sure that it's clear to your listeners that it is an advert. Okay, I'll end the episode this week as usual with the Where Can You Meet Me feature. This coming Monday, the 19th of September, I will be at James Cridland's next radio conference in London. I'm also planning to attend RAIN Summit Europe in London on Wednesday the 2nd of November. Finally, a reminder that International Podcast Day is on the 30th of September this year. Okay, so that's all from the Richard Daly podcast for this week. If you visit my website at richarddaly.com, you'll be able to find all my social media links, as well as the various ways you can subscribe to this show. The show notes for the episode are at richarddaly.com/18. And as usual, please send me your questions or comments. And if there's a topic you'd like me to cover, then you can tweet me. Thank you for listening, and I will see you on the next episode.